All right, so now we're going to be on a kind of coasting, right? We were kind of, I don't know, it's like when you ski, you go up the slope and then you come down. We're going to have a little respite from the difficult texts we have done so far. So these will be much easier read. You will understand every word you read. It's going to be a nice change. The reason for that is that it's a philosophy which is in its at the time when it was written, which is around in the 50s, right? It was nascent. It was a kind of a beginning of African philosophy in the. I have to explain what I mean by that in a second, but this was the beginning of a Western articulation of African ideas, right? So this is a philosophy in its very beginnings. These are we're going to be studying two very important philosophers who are kind of pioneers in this movement of drawing on African stories, African legends, African concepts, and then articulating those in a Western language so that there can be a bridge between the two, so that these can enter into the philosophical discourse that is going on around the world, right? So this is really what they're doing. And so since we're at the beginning, they're just starting out. It's still very, very, although the concepts are interesting and new, the writing is very clear and very pleasant, right? So that's going to be nice. We're going to be in a much more easier context. The only difficulty you might have is when we start studying a little bit of Teilhard de Chardin, who is the scientific basis for Senghor, which we'll talk about today. So yeah, and then after that we'll do Irigaray, which is again going to be kind of a difficult read, but also very poetic. So it should be kind of pleasant to read her at the end. But we're never going to go back to some of those difficult texts like Levinas or Kant to a certain degree is difficult too. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to introduce you to this, to these two thinkers, Senghor and Shati. But first, in general, right, African thought. So obviously, right, African thought has existed for centuries, right? Except it wasn't articulated like Western thought. Right, we've been philosophizing for centuries, but we've been philosophizing through treatises, through like Aristotle. He wrote a whole treatise called Metaphysics, and then you have other writers writing, big books about the topic where they make an argument and they prove their point, kind of like Kant did, right? African philosophy, African thought, right, didn't evolve like that throughout the centuries. African thought was expressed through stories, through songs, through poetry. Through dance, right? So you could have a dance which actually depicted philosophical or kind of deeper ideas about reality, about the nature of reality, about the nature of what it means to be human, what is one's place in the cosmos, right? So Aristotle would write a big treatise, and the Africans, they would compose a dance, right? Which would depict man's place in the cosmos, what does it mean to be human, what is our relationship. It's a very different way of thinking. Or they would have a story, right, featuring animals and so forth. And again, there was a deeper meaning to it. So we are entering now a very different way of philosophizing, right, which has just the same degree of value as the way we do it, but it's just very, very different. So these two philosophers, so of course these traditions, these dances, these songs are passed on from generation to generation, but they were starting to die out, right, as Africa became colonized by the French, the British, the Dutch, whoever went in there, right? As it became colonized, the culture was slowly eroded, right? The people would come in brandishing Christianity, right? And saying you need to abandon these, pagan customs, these satanic practices, right? The satanic music, right? And you need to become European. So slowly, the culture was getting lost, and therefore also the philosophical ideas, the philosophical wealth of the African nations was also being lost through colonization. And so you have a movement in the 20th century, which comes along with the political movements which are of independence, right? Each of these countries now are becoming independent. They're reclaiming their culture. They're getting back who they were, their identity. They're kind of scrambling to recover the lost texts, the lost dances, the lost stories, the lost songs, right? And they're trying to, so these nations are trying to reaffirm themselves as an identity, as having a specific way of thinking, a specific way of seeing the world. And Senghor and Shati are part of this movement of kind of recovering the lost philosophical treasures of Africa, which have been lost for centuries because of colonization. Are you following me? Right? So that's what they're doing, right? They're trying to dig. There's not much left, right? Because a lot has been destroyed culturally. People have forgotten, right? Their stories, they have forgotten their songs, not all, but some. And so they're trying to dig for this lost treasure of philosophical ideas. And that's really what they're doing, right? And then what they're trying to do, so not only that, they're trying to then articulate it in a Western discourse, so that these ideas can now become not only accessible, but have a kind of a respectable place in the international discourse, right? International philosophical discourse, right? You don't come, right? If somebody comes to a philosophy conference and they do a dance, nobody's going to take it seriously, right? Although that would be nice, right? It would change from the stuffiness of all the papers that are being said, right? So what they're trying to do is get these ideas spoken or retold or re-articulated, translated into a Western discourse, so that the West can access these ideas and take them seriously, and so that also the African nations can be part of the general philosophical discourse, right? So that's what they're doing. And their view, of course, is that this, their contribution is going to advance human progress, right? The opening up of philosophical discourse to include African way of thinking is going for them to revitalize the general philosophical discourse, is going to also educate the Western mindset, perhaps also tweak it, right? Criticize it. This, by the way, is what Levinas and Buber were already doing, right? Remember, Levinas and Buber are not Westerners, they're Jews, right? It's different. And they are coming in with a very different perspective and criticizing. You saw how Buber criticized, how Levinas criticized the West, right? So they're already doing this from the Jewish or Hebrew perspective. And these two guys we're going to study are going to do the same from the African perspective. They're going to offer a critique of the Western way of seeing things, and they're going to offer something new to the table. So it's really important that we study them. For many reasons. Number one, so that we realize philosophy is not just a Western thing, not just a Greek thing, right? And also so that we also become open to criticism to the way we've been thinking. There are problems in the way we've been thinking. We saw this already. So we can also become open to criticism and grow at the contact of the other, right? Okay, so let's look a little bit. I'm going to give you some general things that these two thinkers are going to do, and then we'll go and I'll introduce each one. Okay, so first thing they're going to do, I just mentioned a critique of the West. That's the first thing these two philosophers are going to be doing, a critique of the West. And you're going to notice this is so interesting. There are so many similarities between Buber and Levinas and these two guys. It's unbelievable how connected the Hebrew way of thinking and the African way of thinking are. It's like they come from the same, what's this? And then it branches out. Root, tree, trunk, I don't know, source, foundation, but it's like they come from the same source and then they kind of branch out, but they're really so similar, it's unbelievable, right? So they're both going to, so both the Africans and the Hebrews we saw are criticizing the West as being too materialistic. That's the first critique. It's too materialistic. We remember Buber when he said we have lost the spirit because we are just in I-it relationships. There's no spirit anymore. There's no spiritual dimension anymore. We are just material beings. We have lost the breath of our societies. We have lost the spirit because we have lost, right, the ability to relate. So that was Buber, and they're going to say something very similar, right? We have sunk in the West in materialistic society because, and they will say something very similar, we have lost the ability to relate. They're going to say exactly the same thing, but of course in different terms, right? So you have these are cousin philosophies, right? The Hebrew and the African are really related. Second critique of the West is going to be the critique of the subject as the center, right? The subject is the center, the egocentricity of the West. And again, remember how Levinas and Buber criticized that? What did they say? Remind me, let's review. What did they say the true subject really was like? How do they redefine the subject? Both Buber and Levinas do that. How do they redefine the Western subject? Anybody remember? What's the Western subject? And how do Buber and Levinas expand it? Ooh, right now you should know this. Nobody knows, right?
The subject is the center, no?
Yes,
Western,
and then?
the other one with the other.
The other is the center for the other ones, right? They flip it. Yes, I'm going to come back to that.
We, the subject, give me, like the Western thoughts, we give meaning
Yes.
to others, but really it's the opposite. Others give meaning.
Yes, or awaken us, right? Very good. So you're seeing right where they're flipping, the two Jewish philosophers you studied, they flip it, right? They're saying the Western concept is that the subject is the center and the other is around, right, in the periphery. They flip it, they say no, so they're saying the subject is that which constitutes everything around it. They are the ones, you know, who are in a way kind of like a demiurge, like creating reality. And they're saying, no, actually it's the opposite. Reality is awakening us. The other awakens the self. It's not the self constitutes the other, it's the other awakens the self. So the other comes first, and then the self becomes its true self, right? Remember, as long as you're on Fifth Avenue thinking of the shoes you're gonna buy, right? You're not a full self. Only when the person on the street calls out to you and you respond, have you grown to your full potential as a human being, according to Levinas and Buber too, right? So same idea, they're going to say the same thing, right? They're going to be talking also about a decentralized ego, right? Where the self is intrinsically connected to the other. No self without the other for the Africans, right? Very similar to the Hebrews. Likewise, the Hebrews are saying no self without the other. They're going to give a variation on that theme, no self without the other, right? Whereas in the Western, you can be self by yourself and you can reach the highest possible progress by alone, right? We see this, right? Just, I mean, the way we are educated, right? You're educated, and this is very different from the African context, at least traditional context. For us, the highest, right, what our parents are pushing us to do is, you know, get an education, get a job, get a house, right? Correct? Is this the, this is the progression. Africans are saying, get an education, get married, have children, right? And this is the relational view, right? In other words, for them, progress is as you get into more and more intricate relationships, you are progressing. For us, as we're building bigger mansions, we are progressing, right? As we're making more money, we're progressing. In the African context, as we are developing more and more complex relationships, that is how we are progressing. You'll see this idea when we study Shati, right? So it sounds, right, very traditional, but actually when you understand philosophically what they're doing, it's very interesting, right? Basically what they're saying is we grow in relationship. We don't grow in achievements, right? In our society, the more you achieve, the higher you are on the ladder, on the social ladder. In the African context, the more relationships you have and the more variety of relationships you have, the higher you are on the social ladder. That's a very different way of seeing progress and evolution and development than we do, right? Okay, so that's the first thing we're gonna see. Second thing, which I just said, so let me skip that. The notion that we become ourselves through the other, we just talked about that. So I guess just the second thing, there's only two things, not three. The second thing we're gonna notice is that for them, recovering these ancient African thought treasures, right? Philosophical treasures, for them is so important for two reasons. Number one, not just to criticize, right? We just saw that, but also to, how do you say that? To fertilize, to fertilize Western thought. In other words, for them, it's very important if we're going to grow as a world, as a cosmos, not just as individual nations, but if we're going to grow as humanity, we need to open up the table to a variety of perspectives, and we need to start working together in order to find the truth together and what it means to be human and where we are headed, right? For them, and I think especially Senghor would say this, true civilization is universal. True civilization is built among the nations. You can't be over here by yourself and call yourself a civilization, right? Because civilization means you're engaging with other ways of thinking and you're moving together as a humanity. And that is what makes possible true progress, right? So for them, each nation on itself, this is not true progress. And we're gonna see how Senghor argues this. He does a really good job of that. A nation by itself cannot truly progress. It's nations working together that are going to really bring the progress of humanity. And so for them, digging and finding these African treasures and then bringing them to the Western public by garbing them with Western languages is important contribution for them when it comes to the progress of civilization. They really believe the West needs to hear these ideas, right, in order to make it and to not degenerate. And I think they're right, right? If we continue along the line where we are, honestly, of individualism, of I am separate from everybody. I mean, look how we did with COVID. I'll just give you an example, right? COVID struck. All right, we took all the vaccines and we gave them to each other, to ourselves, right? Nobody else in the world, right? They had access. You know this, right? This scandal. Were you familiar with this? Are you hearing me? Are you guys watching the news? You're aware of this? That we hoarded the vaccines, and so there was not enough vaccine for the rest of the world. And so people in the United Nations were saying, this is not the way we deal with the pandemic. Don't think that by taking care of your nation, you're going to deal with the problem efficiently, because somebody over there, that nation over there is all messed up. They're going to come to your country and make it flare up again. Don't be stupid. Let everybody get the vaccine. But we got really, I don't know, that's our mentality. So we hoarded the vaccines. African countries, Indian countries, and so forth didn't have equal access to, didn't have as many vaccines as us, didn't have the money also. And so now we have flare-ups. Well, actually worked out okay for them. They didn't have big flare-ups, but we could have, right? The next pandemic, watch my words, we're not ready. We're not ready as a society, because we will have huge flare-ups over there in African countries, Asian countries, and thinking we're safe, but everything is so interconnected, right? We're not safe until everybody else is safe. That's the African mentality. We are not safe until everybody else is safe. But the West, with its very isolated view of reality, is really creating a lot of future problems when it comes to pandemics, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to anything. The way we think of ourselves as isolated from the world is going to be our downfall, right? We are convinced that if we're good, even the whole world is burning, we're good, it's going to be okay. But it's not the case. Nowadays, everything is so interconnected. If you're not good, I'm not good, right? And we saw this with the pandemic, right? That was test number 1, which we failed. Hopefully the next one is not as bad. Is not worse. Okay, so that's the idea, right? So I really think there is an important moment here where they are really going to be contributing a different way of thinking that can revitalize our way of thinking, that can also help us rethink where we're going and perhaps change course for the better, right? Okay, any questions so far before I get into Senghor and Shati? Okay, so Senghor, S-E-N-G-H-O-R. So hold on, I'm trying to see the text that I'll be doing. Never mind. Okay. All right, so Senghor, so he appears in the mid-20th century, right? 1950s, right? This is Senghor. This is when all the African nations are becoming independent. They're throwing off the yoke of colonialism, and he's appearing in the country of Senegal, right? S-E-N-E-G-A-L. Senegal was a French colony, and it was in the process of becoming independent, and Senghor became the first president of Senegal. Now, he's a very interesting person because he didn't last as a president, but he was also a philosopher, a writer, a poet, right? He was everything. In fact, he was such an amazing writer. I mean, he was educated, in fact, in France. Like, I mean, all the French colonies were totally Frenchized, right? So you had French schools, everything. So you actually felt like you were in France in those French colonies, right? So he was educated there, and in France, he became one of the most, he became so famous as a writer and as a poet that they're classifying him now among some of the greatest French writers, right, of the country, right? He's been classified in this kind of pantheon of amazing, eminent writers. So you should try to look him up. He has also amazing poetry. He's not just a thinker, he's also a poet and so forth, right? So he was our first president of Senegal, and he didn't last, and this is what. His view, which is also, you will see this in his philosophy, was that Senegal should keep ties with France. You know, many countries, when they became independent, they were like, you know, fuck you. we're done with you, we're doing our own thing. One example is Zimbabwe, right? They completely got rid of, I think it was British, right? And they did not maintain ties with them, and they took all the land from whoever was owning land, and created a number of problems because of that, right? Senegal, Senghor wanted Senegal to retain ties so it can retain economic ties, so it can continue to prosper in connection with France, right? And there were a lot of people who were against that, who wanted to cut off ties completely, and so he was eventually deposed as a president, but contributed enormously when it comes to reclaiming African culture, reclaiming African philosophical ideas, and so forth, right? So the movement, so he founded a movement, right? This movement that he's kind of at the head of, where he's trying to reclaim African culture, African way of doing things, African way of seeing the world. This whole movement that he found is called Negritude, Negritude, from Negro, right, which means black. So Negritude was the name of that movement. So this whole movement, he defines it, and he's criticized now of it really a lot, but I don't know if I still stand by him, right? For him, the African man, or any person who is of a different ethnicity, has a specific wisdom, right? For him, the African psyche, the African mind, the African way of embodying, of dwelling in the world is specific, is rich, has value, there is meaning that needs to be recovered, right? So he really believed that just on the basis of having been born in Africa, grown up in the African culture, having the black skin, right? Having a certain body type, it's going to actually influence the way you see yourself in the world, what you have to contribute to the world. So I think he really believed that every ethnicity had a specific wisdom to offer, right? And this idea that, there's, a kind of universal reason, that everyone is the same, right? He's working against that. He's working against modernity, like Kant, right? When Kant says everyone has the same moral sense, everybody thinks the same, he's saying, no, the African man doesn't see the world like the European man, right? And the African woman, we could add, doesn't see the world like the African man, perhaps even, right? So he's really saying there is a diversity of perspectives that are connected to a diversity of bodies, right? If you have a certain body and you come from a certain background, a certain culture, you will see the world very differently, and you have something to offer. And so that's what it means. The whole movement of Negritude is to reconnect with the African genius that has been lost through the centuries of colonization. Okay, so just give you a quick definition, right? Negritude is the values that define Black people. That's how he writes it, right? And when you read the text by Shati, he quotes him on that. Oh, I got that from page 22. Negritude is the values that define Black people. And again, this is all coming from the conviction that Africa, and this is I'm quoting, had something of great value to offer the future civilization of the universe, right? So he really believes we have something to contribute, we need to dig for it, and then we need to bring it to the world, right? Okay, so that's the first thing about Senghor. Second thing, we have his criticism of the West, which I'm going to now hone in on what is his criticism specifically. So main thing he's going to criticize, remember he's writing in the 50s. In the 50s, there are two main centers. There's capitalism and communism, right? There is Russia and the West. These are the two main poles at the time. And as a nation, how do you call it? As a leader, right? As a leader of a nation, he's thinking strategically, should my country ally itself with the capitalist nations, or should it ally itself with the communist nations, right? A lot of the African countries were, when they emerged, they were thinking, okay, should we make alliances with the West, or should we make alliances with Russia? And we have some countries, I think I remember when South Africa was starting to become independent, and they were trying to get support from the West, and were not getting support from the West for the fight against apartheid and so forth. They turned to the Russians, right, for weapons and so forth. So the African countries were really right there, on the stage, on the world stage, able to pick between the two. So Senghor is thinking, should we become communist as a nation? It's a young nation just about to emerge, or should we become capitalist, right? So he's writing about it, and he's going to criticize both, and he's going to say we should stop imitating other people and find our own way. that is really the most important thing he's doing, right? He's saying, let's not just copy capitalism or blindly copy communism, but we need to find an African way to lead our country. That's where he's headed in some of these essays. So here's his criticism of capitalism and communism. For him, they both have the same issue, that they're both seeking strictly material happiness. I think Buber said that too, right? It's like, it's crazy how I know they didn't read each other, right? But they sound so alike. It's something, I cannot imagine Senghor having read Buber, although maybe, who knows? He could have. But it's very similar, right? Both are seeking just material happiness, and they're not really trying to realize that there's something more than happiness, right? Kant said that. Remember, what did Kant say? Remind me. What did Kant say about happiness? Let's do a review. Remember.
There is none.
I mean, there is, but
it's not something to strive for.
Yes, it's not the highest calling, right? There's no happiness. It's not that bad.
It does sound like his type of thing to say.
I know. I mean, I'm sure he's not, he's not like cheerleading for, our quest for happiness. But yeah, there is happiness, but it's not the highest goal, right? It's the same thing. He's saying Western societies, whether it's Russian or European or American societies, just looking for material happiness. And so they only differ in the sense that capitalism is individual happiness and communism is collective happiness. But both is the same highest goal for them is material gain, material wealth, material prosperity. And he's saying this is so low. This is not enough. We are not really achieving the highest potential as nations because we're stopping there. What about spiritual, right, elevation? What about spiritual development, right? And he's saying the West has killed the spirit. Right? He's sounding very much like Nietzsche when he says that, but he's saying we have killed the spirit, right? We have destroyed any sense of the spiritual or relegated it over here in religion, some obscure religions that people practice and look idiotic doing. He's saying we have lost as a society the concept of the spiritual. We have relegated it to the, old worn coffers of the church, right, or the synagogue or the temples, but we have forgotten as a society, we have become so secularized that we are refusing now any allusion to spirit, right? And he's going to talk a lot about that. So again, right, he's going to say all we're seeking is material happiness. There's no sense of community and community ethics. It's not important. Hence, the lack of spirit, the lack of breath, the lack of dynamic. The lack of, he's going to say this lack of community is leading to a lack of strength, and we are not dynamic anymore because of that. We're losing our energy, and we're going to look at how he talks about that. So that's the first critique of Europe. The second one, do I want to talk about that? I'm going to skip that. Maybe rapidly. Yeah, I have no time. Okay. Second thing he's going to look at, yeah, this is actually important. He's going to criticize the subject-object attitude of the West, right? We're always looking at the subject and then everything else is an object. And we have this concept that the subject is in control and the world is just at our mercy. We decide everything in the world. And he's going to say, why can't we look more in terms of subject? Or more specifically in terms, instead of a, domination of the subject over the object, we need to rethink reason, right? In a way that is not this dominating subject-object approach. And he's saying, why not see more reason as the product of a confrontation between subject and object? Okay, let me say that again, because this is really important. He's saying the Western mind is seeing everything in terms of a domination of the subject over the object. I decide everything, what everything is. He's saying we need to shift even the way we look at the world if we're going to progress. We need to shift even the way we look at objects if we're going to move forward. And he's saying we need to look at objects, we need to look, the subject-object should be seen as a confrontation where the object also informs the subject, right? This is what Levinas was saying, right? We have the sensory impression, and then we decide. Here we have a dialogue, right? The object is contributing to what we say it is, right? We have the sensory impression, and based on that, we come to a conclusion. This is working with the object, right? We're not alone deciding everything. So he's saying that we need to be more in the confrontation between subject-object. And this, he says, we need to understand that knowledge occurs through dialogue, through conversation, not through imposition, right? Remember, colonial times, knowledge is imposed. He's saying, no, we need to have a dialogue between the object and the subject. They need to come into confrontation, into dialectic communication, into conversation, into dialogue. The subject needs to also have a say, a voice, the object, right? Are you following? So you can see the background of this, right? The African is the object of the human, of the European subjects, right? They come, the European subject comes into Africa. Everybody is an object that we can dominate. And he's saying, well, the object also has a voice. The object also has something to say. And they need to enter into dialogue rather than having just one-sided imposition. So he talks about a new way of seeing reason as a kind of receptive intelligence rather than active, masterful intelligence, right? The West sees reason as a master, deciding everything. He's saying, no, reason must become more of a receptive intelligence. I am in tune with reality, and based on this attunement, I can decide what it is. But I first have to come into attunement with what I am dealing with before I can say anything about it. Whereas the West comes in, parachutes in, right, and begins to, dictate what reality looks like, and so forth. He's saying, no, we first need to come into contact, be sensitive, feel our way through, and then we, by the way, I'll give you an example of that so it's less abstract. Here's, yeah, I had to learn this actually. I was very Western. So you know how you want to help someone, right? Let's see how many of you are Western, how many of you are African, right? When you want to help someone, how many of you are like this? You know exactly what they need to do, and you're going to tell them. Anybody? That's me. I mean, I can tell right away. Like, I see you, and I can, the whole diagnostic pops up in my mind, the solution, what you got to do, and I will tell you, right? This is the Western approach. I'm the expert, you are the mess, I'm going to tell you what to do, right? Now, how would the African approach the situation? What do you think, based on what I just said?
First listen for a very long time before making up their mind about anything.
Exactly. You would listen, get feedback. What's going on? Tell me a little bit, right? You wouldn't know until you've listened. Whereas I can come, I see your face. Yeah, this is what you got to do. So this is the idea that we first receive, listen, attune ourselves to what they need to hear. This is a good one because you come in and you kind of sweep into someone's life and give them advice that they didn't want, right? Have you ever done that? Totally unsolicited advice. But you're good about yourself because, yeah, you said what you had to say, but it didn't go in. Why? Because you didn't spend the time to hear what do they really need to hear. Sometimes they don't need to hear your grand master plan for their progress, right? Sometimes they need to hear something else. And if you can't attune yourself to whoever you're talking to, you will not know what word will be the right word. Do you follow? That's the African reason compared to the European reason, right? According to Senghor. So that's the idea here. There's one more thing I have to say, but I forgot it. Was that in your question? Did you say something? Because I think there was something you said that triggered. Yeah, we forgot. Okay. Okay, so you're following the difference, right? That's what, and he's saying we need to change even the way we think and look at reality instead of imposing. We have an agenda and we impose it. We need to be more attuned, listen carefully. This is what they need to hear. Okay, this is what I will say at this moment, right? He calls it sympathetic reason. You can write this down if you want. Sympathetic reason. So that's the second thing he's going to talk about, which is really, really interesting. Third thing, and this is where some of you are going to be lost and left behind because it becomes very how shall I put it? It sounds like science fiction, But he actually has scientific basis for what he's saying. So we will get into the scientific basis, but when I'm going to say it now, it's going to sound like science fiction. Unless you have a good knowledge of contemporary physics, you'll be able to follow. Basically what he's going to argue, and this will be his main idea, is that we are not material beings, we are energetic beings. Now, if you've done physics, this sounds familiar. Anybody know what he's talking about? In the physics, we're talking about that already. Yes, we are not material beings, we are energetic beings. You find this, the basis for this idea, which is, by the way, a very old African traditional idea, that we're energies and not, matter. This is a very ancient idea, but in contemporary physics, you have this, actually, you have elements of this idea. Anybody done physics so far? Anybody studied physics? I was doing high school physics, and, oh, you are? Okay. I was doing some high school physics with a friend of mine, and already there you can see elements pointing to that we're not material beings, we're not just matter, we're actually pure energy. Anybody have any proof for that in physics? Think of the structure of the atom. Yes.
Our cells are always moving.
So we're always moving, true, but look at the atom, what it's made of. You have nucleus. So you have a nucleus, and then you have
Protons and neutrons.
and they're like, and there's
Orbitals.
they're very, very small, right? So actually you have mostly space, right? You have mostly space in the atom. This is what's crazy. Because when I touch myself, it's like, I feel there's no space. It's very dense, but actually the element of our existence is completely open. There is it's just movement, right? The atom is just movement. It's energy. It's not, it's an open space with energy, right? There's no heavy, right? It's not, the atom is not a big nucleus, right? Taking up a whole space. It's a tiny nucleus and then a huge amount of space with moving stuff, right? So even in physics, we are discovering, and I think Einstein also stumbled on this, right? That we are energetic beings. We are not material beings. We are actually mostly energy, right? In fact, the famous formula, right? E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the velocity, right? This is basically saying there's an equivalency between energy and mass. That's what he's saying, right? What looks like mass is in fact energy. Yes?
The fact that we're living things doesn't define that we're not materialistic.
Yeah, exactly. And this thing that makes us live is what the Hebrews call the breath, and they will call this a specific name called siriti, which is spirit or energy. Right? So this is new to us because we are used to thinking we're just big bunch of matter and we have a kind of tiny soul, or a brain, right? Moving things around. But they're basically saying we are primordially energetic beings. And actually, you'll get, you can sense this if you're a little bit intuitive. How many of you, you hang out with a friend and then you come home drained? Anybody have this? Like you have friends like that, they drain you? Anybody? Right? Or you go on a date and you come home exhausted, like the conversation was so heavy, right? So, or then you go out again with different friends and you come home energized, right? Are you seeing what this happened too? What happened? Exchange of energy, right? Either they sucked your energy or they gave you energy, but you can tell a lot of our interactions are actually energetic. They're not necessarily physical. We are interacting energetically. Or you come in and you can sense, you meet someone and you have like a really bad feeling, like they feel really negative and toxic. Anybody sense somebody really toxic, like from a mile away? Anybody have this ability? You're like, ah, don't come near me, right? You can you see around them the demon swirling, right? So, right? So you can say, this is energy. Well, who is telling you there's demons swirling around this person? How you don't see a demon, right? You don't know why, right? This is all showing us that we're not just material beings sitting here and then another material being there. There's energetic exchange all day long, right? We are energetically exchanging all day long. And so we need to understand this. If we're going to understand there's a huge ramification of this, which has to do as to why community is so important, and we'll come to that. So first of all, right, this is one first thing we will learn, is that everything is spirit in the African mindset, in the traditional African mindset, everything is spirit. What's interesting is that contemporary physics they're converging now with this very ancient thought. Yeah.
The feeling of energy, is that
Do they have a third eye? I
I
thought
don't
that
know,
was the Hindus.
that's what they're like. 'Cause I have actual friends that their parents are like super like private, like black magic and stuff like that.
Oh, so I'm not familiar with the third eye or anything. But yeah, the whole magical mentality
Yeah.
too is the idea that you can, there is an energetic current between me and you, and I can actually influence you. Even though I'm over here and you're over there, there is energetic current where I can influence you. So that would be the magical mentality. But he's missing even beyond magic. Just an everyday interaction, normal interaction. You can influence me, I can influence you, depending on my energy and your energy, right? We are, even though we are not even touching, I am touching you, and you're touching me. You see what I mean? Why? Because there's an energetic field between us, right? This is a new idea for us, right? If you're a little bit new agey, you're good with it. You're like, yeah, I get it. But if you're not new agey at all, you're like, what? What's going on? This is very new. So he continues by saying, right, this is typical of traditional African thought that everything, this is the animist mentality, right? Where everything has a soul, everything has a spirit, everything basically has an energy. That's what he's saying, right? Even the table, even the pencil has a certain energy. Colors have energies, right? Trees, animals, people have energies, and we are constantly in touch with them. Even though I am here in this classroom, the outside is affecting me, right? Basically, this notion of energy is one of the most important ramifications, that everything is energy, is that everything is interconnected. This is the most important ramifications. Let me say that again, right? The fact, if it is true that everything is energy, then at the same time, what we realize immediately as a consequence is that everything is interconnected. If it starts to rain outside, gonna affect my mood. If you burst into tears over here, it's gonna touch me, right? So we are interconnected, meaning this is going against the Western view that I can be over here all by myself, completely not disturbed by you. Not true. We are always energetically intertwined. So whatever's happening to you is actually eventually happening to me, right? It's going to affect me. And so we can't separate ourselves. You know, we see even the way our cities are built, right? In the United States, you have whole neighborhoods, just these people, and then whole neighborhoods, just these people, right? And we're separating by class, right? This is poor neighborhood, rich neighborhood, and the rich neighborhood thinking is good, you know. We got rid of these guys, right? They're over here all stacked up, right? Thinking there's no connection. Actually, there is always a connection. There is an influence, right? And you cannot escape. As long as the city has these poor neighborhoods, it's gonna have an impact on the rich neighborhoods. You see this especially very powerfully in South Africa, which is extremely divided society. You have extremely wealthy people and then extremely poor people. And when you go to the wealthy houses, they have walls up to the roof of the house. I am serious, walls thick like this with security systems. I mean, this is a prison, right? This idea that I can live and be wealthy and not even care, it's affecting. It's creating a prison around their homes, around their gardens, right? You're imprisoning yourself behind these big walls. It's having an impact, right? So that's the idea, is that we are, because we are energetic beings, we are intertwined. And anything that happens to you is going to happen to me. Like I'm going to feel, if I'm talking to you and you start to like, you know, become depressed or angry, it's going to affect me, right? It's going to ruin my day, and then then I'm going to ruin someone else's day with my negative energy, right? And so forth. So that's the idea. Very different idea that we have. At the same time, that we can influence each other. Energies for him, when there's a lot of people, creates higher level of energy. And this is how we redynamize our societies for him. The more people, the more energy, the more life. That's what he's saying, right? And this is why in the African context, community is the highest value, because community means more people, means more energy, means more life. And so for them, it's interesting. Good and evil is measured differently than for us. Good and evil is whatever, so good is whatever heightens the energy of a society. Evil is whatever lowers the energy of a society. So if you're creating a community with a lot of people and everybody is, you know, functioning well, you are adding to the energy, you're doing something good. If you're taking away from that community, if you're separating people, or if you're expulsing people, or if you're keeping people on a low energy level by, you know, burying them in poverty and oppression, you're losing the energy and you're draining the life of that society, right? So for them, that's how they do it. Very, very different view for us, but very interesting. Okay, so so the basis for this whole, especially this section on energy, we're going to study, this is a very difficult name, so I'm going to spell it for you. This is the scientific basis for what Senghor is saying. Is going to be the work of Teilhard de Chardin. Okay, this is French. So write this down. First name, T-E-I-L-H-A-R-D. And it's pronounced Teilhard. Everybody say after me, Teilhard. Teilhard. Okay, good. Because it looks like tail heart, and I don't want to hear that from you. Okay, Teilhard. And then de, D-E. And then Chardin, C-H-A-R-D-I-N. So together, Teilhard de Chardin, right? Very important evolutionary biologist, right? In the 19th century, early 20th. So he was actually a priest. Teilhard de Chardin was a priest, but he was also a geologist, a paleontologist. And he, I mean, I read him to prepare for Senghor, and I was amazed at how brilliant his writing is and how, I mean, it's cutting edge and inspiring. I mean, you could make a science fiction movie from that writing. It's so interesting. And the main idea, which we'll come back to, and you'll see how brilliant it is that for him, so he's an evolutionary biologist. He says we are moving, when he looks at the way we have evolved, he notices, and this is very interesting, we start very material, very simple organisms, zero consciousness. That's what he observes. The beginning of our evolution is simple organisms, zero consciousness. As the organism becomes more and more complex, consciousness arises. Okay, this is very important for what he and Senghor is going to use this idea masterfully to make a really interesting point. Okay, so he's looking simple organisms, low consciousness. The more complex the organism, higher level of consciousness, right? And so what he's realizing is that we're moving from low consciousness to high consciousness. We are moving from matter to spirit. We are becoming more and more spiritual as we evolve. And so the question Teilhard de Chardin is going to ask is going to say, man is now the highest. We are the most complex organism of all of nature, and we are also the most conscious, the most spiritual. And so the question Teilhard de Chardin is going to ask, which is masterful, he's going to say, what's the next step for us? And I'm going to leave it in suspense for now, because he's going to come up with an amazing next step of evolution. What is the next stage of evolution if we follow this trajectory? Anybody want to take a wild guess? What would be the next stage of evolution? Remember, you evolve going from simple to complex, and as you go from simple to complex, you go from unconscious to more and more conscious, right? What's the next stage? Anybody have any ideas? What would be the next jump we have to make to become powerfully evolved beyond just human? Yeah.
To form complex communities in line with our complex nature.
You got it. As humans get together, creates an even more complex organism, an even more awakened organism. Isn't this powerful? Basically, he's saying the secret to evolution is community. If we are able, as a human society, to get together in the world and create a hugely complex organism, which is made up of all of the nations, all of the different people, all of the different countries, we are going to reach such a high level of consciousness that we will come to the full evolution of our full capacity of evolution. Do you follow that? Isn't that cool? I don't know. I love it. No? Yes? No? Just like, no, nothing hit you. Nothing hit you. I was hit like by a comet when I saw that. I was like, oh my goodness, he just demonstrated, so Teilhard de Chardin basically demonstrates biologically, right, scientifically, the need for human cooperation, and how human cooperation is that which will bring us to the next stage of evolution. Until we remain separate, we're going to be on a low stage of evolution. When human beings start to aggregate and form together a huge complex organism, that's when we will reach the highest level of consciousness and awakening and spirit. And that's the next step that we need to take. And Senghor is going to jump on that bandwagon. He's going to be like, yes, And that's why he says we need African nations to cooperate with European nations and with Asian nations, and we need to create this kind of world cooperation of nations where everyone has a say, everyone is respected, everyone is elevated. That's how we reach true progress, right? So this is some of the ideas you'll see in his writing. Okay, any questions before I go to Shati? Okay. Okay, so Shati, he is South African, and he taught in Cape Town, died recently, 2016. He was also a priest and then got married, quit and got married. So he is actually going to be working on two African concepts, the concept of Ubuntu and the concept of Seriti. So Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U, very important, U-B-U-N-T-U. So this is in the language, in the African language, this is the concept that he's going to extract and then reflect on philosophically. And the other concept is Seriti, S-E-R-I-T-I. Seriti, S-E-R-I-T-I. So the first idea, Ubuntu, is the idea that we are a person through other persons. That's the definition of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is to be a person through other persons. Can't be a full person by yourself. You need other persons to get to your full personhood. A person is a person through other persons. And Seriti is the idea that we are energetic beings, and therefore we are interconnected. And you see how it overlaps with Senghor a little bit, right? We're seeing that in Senghor also, even though they're in completely different parts of the continent of Africa, right? So first thing, so we're going to look at a couple things that he's going to talk about. So Shati, let me skip that. Well, let me just say. And by the way, when you read the book Philosophy for Africa, you will see everything I've been talking about. He talks about Senghor, he talks about all these things. Okay, so first thing he says, we need to begin to philosophize about reality, about where we are as human beings, not just be philosophers in the abstract. So remember, Shati is emerging as a philosopher around the time that Mandela is trying to unite the South African country, right? This is a new beginning for that country. They're trying to break away from the oppression, and he's thinking alongside of Mandela and trying to think, okay, how can we rebuild our country morally also? Not enough to rebuild the country materially, we have to rebuild it morally. So the whole book that you're going to read, Philosophy for Africa, is his attempt at showing a moral path for South Africans so that they can evolve morally alongside of their evolution, which is physical and economic, right? He believes if we only evolve economically and we don't evolve morally, we're going to become a country which, again, will have very wealthy people and very poor people. We're not going to get out of this mess. It will just be different color who is on the top, right? Instead of having white, black, it's going to be black, black. And actually, this is kind of a little bit the case now, right? Didn't really work. Not many people read Shati. Right now, you still have this very elite class ruling over the masses. And now it's not a question of color anymore, it's a question of class, right? So, but he really believed that we cannot evolve as a society if we only look to evolve economically. We need to also evolve morally, and that's why he wrote the book, so that people could become attuned to the African way of being moral, right? So he's trying to recover these ancient concepts so Africans can, go back to their roots and learn again what it means to be human, remember what it means to be human in their own traditions, and that's his purpose, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing, he realizes at the same time that we have to dig for our treasures. We have to understand that because we have been colonized for so many years, we are now a hybrid identity. And we have to accept that. We are both black and white, basically, he's saying. We have been influenced for centuries now by European thinking, and yet we are Africans. Let us just embrace ourselves as a hybrid identity, and let's not reject the European part of us, which is now a part of us, and let's not reject the African part of us, but let's bring the two together. So very important for him to, and he thinks, he really believes that bringing the two together is what is going to dynamize the society, revitalize South African society. We can't toss out one or the other. We need to bring the two together as we bring the white part of us with the black part of us, right? And he's talking for all Africans, right? All South Africans. We have a white part, we have a black part. Let's bring it together because the two together are going to be very fecund. They will fertilize each other. They will dynamize the society. So similar to Senghor, right? Who wanted to stay in touch with France. He's saying we need to also not discard European values. At the same time, right, he believes that African thought not only can enrich the European thought, but it can also correct it, right? So same idea as Senghor, that African thought, African ideas can correct the Western perspective on many levels. Okay, so let me give you an example of how, so remember, he's thinking about Ubuntu philosophically. At the same time, Mandela and the Bishop Desmond Tutu, to spell Tutu, T-U-T-U, right? The Bishop Tutu, are working together to purify the nation, right? You're familiar with the history, right? Hopefully, right? You had the white super class, right? And everybody else was in ghettos, right? And they didn't have the right to marry, they didn't have the right to travel, they were stuck in ghettos, they were really oppressed. And meanwhile, the white elite population, had all the wealth, had all the power. And so when Mandela started his revolution, it was really first, it's interesting, Mandela's evolved a lot. He first wanted a black nation, right? And then he ended up in prison for 20 years. And initially he was kind of a revolutionary, very passionate revolutionary, a very violent man, actually. He ended up in prison for 20 years and learned a lot in prison, right? Never despise the prisons you find yourselves in, right? In the prison, for the first time, he was in contact with all kinds of different backgrounds because there were all kinds of prisoners there. White prisoners, Indian prisoners, colored prisoners, black prisoners. And he started to connect with all of these different people. And he came to an awakening that he didn't want to create a black nation anymore. He wanted to create a rainbow nation, right? So that's where he started to evolve as a politician. And he realized, I don't want South Africa to be black. I want South Africa to be rainbow. And so every faction will have power. It's not going to be blacks have power and then the rest are kind of, guests in the country. It's going to say, no, we're going to create a coalition. So he learned a lot. He also became much more patient and calm so that when he emerged 20 years later, he was a completely different man, right? You see that even in his face. And so he is working to take a new direction, an African direction for the country. And so I'll give you an example of how he and Bishop Tutu used the concept of Ubuntu to pave a new political future for the country. So let me explain. Let me remind you. Ubuntu is, how do I put it simply? A person is a person through other persons, or you could also say, whatever you go through, I go through. Whatever I go through, you go through. Whatever happens to me, happens to you. Whatever happens to you, happens to me. That's Ubuntu, right? So, watch this. He comes to power. And now the question arises, what do we do with the white elites who oppressed us, who tortured us, who killed us, who persecuted us, who imprisoned us, right? We need justice. We need to find a way to punish these perpetrators for the crimes against humanity that they have committed. Remember, they were extremely barbaric, right? The white elites were extremely barbaric. They would torture, they would kill, they would rape, they would pillage, they would destroy for years, decades, right? This was going on. So he's saying we need to have some kind of justice if we're going to start with a clean slate. And so he's pondering the Western way of doing things. Western way is you put everyone in jail and you have a bunch of death penalties. And so he's thinking, if I do this, I cannot build my rainbow nation because the white population is always going to resent me for killing their elites, right? For putting their elites in jail. And so he's trying to think, he wants to create a coalition between all the colors. So he can't have one color be punished really, really strongly. You see what I'm saying? So he has to find a different way. So he's talking to the bishop, this Montutu, and they are coming up with the concept of Ubuntu, which is we need to realize that whatever happens to them will happen to us, whatever happens to us, we are interconnected with the whites. The black population is interconnected with the white elites. We are not separate. And so they decided to do this. They decided before we can be liberated, they have to be liberated, right? The fact that we are oppressed shows that they are also in some way oppressed. And so before we can truly be liberated, we have to truly liberate them or allow them to liberate themselves. So what do you think they did? What did they need to do to be liberated, these white elites? Why were they, in a way, oppressed, and what did they need to be liberated? If you remember Levinas, it will help you. Yes.
Connections with other people, with like people of other races and stuff.
Okay, exactly. They're in a way in the prison of the self that Levinas talks about, right? They are in a way, any oppressor is in a way a tortured soul, right? So they said, we're going to free you so that we can become free. And the way we're going to free you is not by putting you in jail. We're going to allow you to confess all the wrongs you have done, and then we will allow you to repair all the damage you have done. So they had televised confessions and forgiveness, collective forgiveness. So these guys would come, very powerful men, right? Used to be powerful men. They would come on national TV and confess everything that they did. And then they would receive not a punishment, but a way to restore whatever they had done wrong. So they would have to contribute to the communities they had wronged in some way. And this is how so they didn't punish anyone. No one was in jail. No one was, executed. And they did this. They said, now we are liberating you from your own evil. And this is now, we are able now finally to be free. Just putting them in jail and being vengeful, they intuited, would not solve the problem. We would still be oppressed. We would still be resentful, feeling the hatred. We wouldn't heal. We couldn't heal. As long as you're not healed, we're not healed, right? Very powerful idea. In Rwanda, they did something very similar, which is very problematic in a way. You remember in the 90s, there was a genocide of 2 different ethnic groups. Really bad genocide. I mean, it was a massacre. And they followed the same model when they realized that, half the population had killed the other half, basically. And they realized we don't have enough jail space to put half of the population. We have to find a way to start again. And so they did the same thing. Whoever killed these members of a family in this particular village has to go now to that village, live with that family, and work for them for a certain amount of years, contribute. Very, very problematic to see the person who killed your family live with you and work with you, right? So many people in Rwanda actually resented that practice, but this was the same application of the concept of Ubuntu. Until you are restored, I cannot truly be restored, right? So it was a difficult pill to swallow for many Rwandans, but it restored society. You go to Rwanda today, it's the Switzerland of Africa. It's one of the most organized places. I put it on their benevolent dictator. Some places need dictators. Right? Rwanda, to be honest, I don't know if you've heard a lot from the dictator Kagame. He's amazing. He held the country together after the war for 20 years, right? And really, really restored the country and made it possible for the society to blend again, right? So that's again another application of the Ubuntu, right? That we cannot truly be healed until you are healed. Until the oppressor goes through a healing process, the victim cannot truly heal. It's not enough to just execute the perpetrator. That doesn't heal me. That you are now executed. Makes me feel a little good, but I'm not healed. The healing comes as you're healing, I am able to heal. That's a very profound idea that you don't find in the West. I have never seen the equivalent in the West. I was blown away when I read this, right? The way they do this. Okay, actually it's very interesting. When you go to Rwanda, they have a museum of the genocide. And so you go in, just to give you the mentality, right? You go in and, you go through the whole thing, you see all the deaths and all the pictures and everything. And then you come out and it's a garden, like an amazing garden. And this garden was built, guess where? Worst possible place, maybe best possible place. What do you think? On what was this garden built? On a mass grave, right? There was a mass grave there and they built a garden on top. This is just to give you the mentality, right? It's very powerful. I haven't seen like, I've been to several Holocaust museums or Museum of Slavery, but I have never seen like this opening, right? The way that they opened up the whole story onto this amazing garden built on a mass grave, as though to say, this, so again, the notion of healing versus the notion of punishment, right? It's a different approach. We want vengeance, we want punishment, and they want restoration and healing, right? That's the difference between our two societies, right? The whole concept, by the way, of restorative justice is really connected to that way of thinking. Right? We don't punish, we restore. Why? So I can be restored, right? Okay, so this should give you a good idea. The first text I believe we'll do, does anybody have it? The syllabus, just tell me, do I have the syllabus? It's which one is it? What did I give you? Oh, I hope I gave you the right one. Let me see. Yes, it's Chardin, right? The first one. So this is a scientific text, right? That written in the, I forgot if it's written in the late 19th or probably early 20th century. Right, so the scientific text, you just have a few pages. Based on that, Senghor is going to build his ideas, right? And then we'll finish with Shetty. Okay. Any questions on anything?
Was there no reading assignment for today?
No?
Oh, of course I did it when there wasn't one.
What did I do?
Wow.
Okay.
There was a reading.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yes, you were supposed. Did you read?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you had a good background to what I was saying. I was kind of recapitulated, right? What you read? Yes.
When I was reading it, I was thinking that like it almost sounds like plagiarism of Buber. Like let's use the same concepts and just switch the wording, but obviously it wasn't. But it sounded so
Crazy,
similar.
right? I know, it's unbelievable. Like I wonder if he read Buber. He could have, because he comes after Buber, right? And he was in France, and,
Right.
but Buber wasn't popular in France.
But it makes sense for them both to have come up with like the same concepts because they were both came from groups that were similarly otherized by the West.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. And also there are connections between African thought and Hebrew thought, because we know Hebrew thought emerged from the African continent, right? It's a similar area, right? This is the whole Middle East, right, is thinking like that, right? And it's very connected to the African continent. So there were a lot of connections between the Hebrew Bible and the continent of Africa. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that there are so many connections, right? But yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, you were supposed to read just to, because it was a great introduction, and I was going to be kind of lecturing on that. Awesome. Okay. So yeah. So next time we'll do Chardin, which is next week. Is it next week? Are we done? This week?
Yeah, it's Wednesday.
Okay, good. Your essays are due on Sunday, right? Sunday? What did we say?
Sunday noon.
Sunday noon, not night.
Monday.
Sunday noon. Sunday noon, you have your Levinas papers, and then yeah, that's it. And then you'll have the Wednesday after for a redo if you want to have an extra one, and then saying this to you, Sunday after is the final draft. Okay, you got this? Okay, everything is in the Blackboard. Yes.
Do we have reading assignments next week?
Yeah. Now we have 3 reading assignments coming up.
Monday and Wednesday?
Huh?
Next week, Monday and Wednesday?
Yes, Monday and Wednesday. Like usual.
This needs to be a writing intensive class.
It will be. I agree. It's just.
Can we retroactively get the W?
Like, I would love that. Can someone find out? I would love to give you a W on this class.
I mean, I doubt
Is
it,
it?
but
I don't need it.
right
I would love that. If someone, yeah.
I don't need like your credit.